So now we come to the artistic contributions of ancient Greece, and here we're going to emphasize the contributions made by Greek artists during the classical period, not because there were no important Greek artists before that era, but because we simply don't know very much about them. During the classical period, the Greeks became one of the first cultures to develop a distinctive artistic style associated with them, which scholars, particularly art historians, have come to refer to as the classical style. So, what was this classical style in Greek art? Well, before we can delve into that, it should be noted that much of what we um, much of what we know about the classical style in Greek art comes not from the Greeks directly, but actually from the Romans, who were passionate imitators of Greek culture and often literally copied uh, the work of Greek masters. So that many of the finest examples of classical Greek art that we possess are actually Roman copies of originals that no longer exist. So that should kind of be stated up front. So back to the question, what was the classical style? Well, in a nutshell, the term classical style refers to a style of artistic expression that places a high value on three core elements: balance, naturalism, and humanism. First, balance. Greek artists prioritized the values of simplicity and harmony and symmetry and proportion, or to put it in a single word, balance, in all of their artistic creations. Second, naturalism. They wanted to depict the natural world, including human beings, as it really was, or as they really were, without elaboration or embellishment. And number three, humanism. Greek artists of the classical period focused much of their work on the words, thoughts, and deeds of human beings. Now, the Greeks didn't leave behind any art manuals that described these principles in explicit terms, at least none that have survived today. But the Romans did. For example, the Roman architect Vitruvius, who wrote a manual on architecture, claimed that he patterned his buildings on the natural symmetry and harmony found within the human body. As he puts it from this manual, the Roman architect, for the human body is so designed by nature that the face, from the chin to the top of the forehead and the lowest roots of the hair, is a tenth part of the whole height. The open hand from the wrist to the tip of the middle finger is just the same. And the head from the chin to the crown is an eighth. And with the neck and shoulder from the top of the breast to the lowest roots of the hair is a sixth. The other members too have their own symmetrical proportions, and it was by employing them that famous artists and sculptors of antiquity, and when he says famous artists and sculptors of antiquity, he's referring to the Greeks, the Greek artists, attained to great and endless renown. Similarly, in the members of a temple, there ought to be the greatest harmony in the symmetrical relations of the different parts to the general magnitude of the whole. Now, keep in mind what Vitruvius is describing here are what were widely considered ideal proportions in the human body. It's not that every human body necessarily exhibited those proportions, but they're probably based on the average of measurements taken of numerous individuals, not the real proportions found that are necessarily going to be found in every human being. It's also significant that Vitruvius bases his concept of architectural symmetry on the bodily symmetry found in human beings. This is indicative of another cardinal feature of Greek/Roman art. It's humanism. Humanism in this context refers to a consistent focus on the words, thoughts, and deeds of human beings. So now you have an idea of what the classical style was all about. So let's look at some examples of it in different artistic mediums. And the first medium we're going to look at is sculpture. Sculpture is probably the medium where the two core themes of Greek art, balance and humanism, are most clearly evident. Now, there are two caveats that need to be made about this. First, very few original sculptures from the classical period in Greece survive. So, again, as I said before, most of the ones that we have are copies made by Roman artists of Greek originals. Second, Greek statues were usually made of bronze, whereas the Roman copies are usually made of marble. That's because, by the way, bronze statues would often be broken apart and melted down for other purposes. But one great example of classic Greek sculpture is Polykleitos' Doryphorus, which roughly translates to the spear bearer. What we actually have here is, again, a Roman copy in marble of a Greek original that was probably cast in bronze. So you have a figure of a Greek warrior holding onto a spear, shifting into a dramatic contrapposto pose. Now, that word contrapposto, it comes from the Italian Renaissance, and it literally means counterpoise. And it refers to an asymmetrical arrangement of the body in which the line of the arms and shoulders contrast with, while balancing out, those of the hips and the legs. In this case, the spear bearer is shifting his weight onto his right leg, as you can see in this picture, causing his whole body to react, the upper portion of his body to react in the other direction. The arms and shoulders move in the opposite direction in order to maintain balance. This pose was very popular with Greek artists of the classical period and their Roman and later Renaissance imitators because it's a more natural way to stand. It reflects more how human beings actually do stand in real life. The spear bearer is also a great example of both naturalism and humanism in Greek sculpture. It depicts a very natural pose. Also because classical Greek art often consciously emphasizes the natural beauty and symmetry of the human form, which of course can best be displayed when the human form isn't wearing any clothes, which is why most famous Greek statues depict their subjects posing en natural, in other words, in the nude. Another famous Greek sculpture by the artist Myron is the discus thrower. The discus thrower. And again, we have a Roman marble copy, whereas the Greek original would have been in bronze. And again, we're immediately struck by the sense of balance that the statue gives us. You have four contrasting diagonal angles, or diagonal lines, rather, I should say. One from the feet to the knees, so one from here to here, one from the knees to the hips, one from the hips to the shoulders, and one from the shoulder to the end of the arm that is holding the discus. And again, the figure is nude because, again, Greek athletes competed in the nude, so naturally he would be. Significantly, the artist has chosen here to capture the moment right before the release of the discus, right? The athlete in this statue is winding up. He's getting ready to spring into action and release that discus just as far as he can throw it. Now, why is this? Well, the artist chooses this moment to portray because this is the moment where the body is preparing to obey the mind or intellect of the athlete. And here we can see the Platonic emphasis of mind over body. Just as Plato taught that there was a tripartite division in the human soul, with the highest part being the mind or the reason, and that the other elements of a human being should obey the mind and reason. This statue kind of depicts that idea in visual form. Sculpture is also very naturalistic. There's lots of attention to detail with the ribs, being portrayed here, the muscle contours, the veins in the leg, and so on. The only unnatural element of the sculpture is the serene, almost contemplative expression on the athlete's face. The athlete's face isn't, screwed up in a grimace, as it, sort of naturally would be if you were about to undertake an extremely physical exercise. And why is that? Well, this is very common among classical Greek artists. They liked to depict their subjects with a very calm, deliberate expression on their faces, because it showed, again, that they were thinking about what they were doing. And again, the point being conveyed here is that the reason or mind should rule over the body and also over our passions and emotions. The last example I want to show you is Praxiteles' Aphrodite of Cnidus. This is our first female statue, and again, it's a Roman copy of a Greek original. And again, it's a depiction of a beautiful, symmetrical, well-proportioned nude figure, striking a contrapposto pose similar to what we saw with the spear bearer. Her nudity is a bit of a departure from the norm, though. Unlike statues of men, early Greek statues of women were usually clothed. It's hard to say whether this was for modesty or because the Greeks considered the female body inferior to the male body, but female subjects were usually depicted clothed, but not in this case. Two other interesting points about this statue that are worth mentioning. The first are her wide hips, but also small breasts. Now, why is that? Again, not entirely clear, but small breasts could be an indication of virginity, as women's breasts do tend to grow larger after nursing begins. The wide hips, however, are probably suggestive of fertility, which is, of course, appropriate for Aphrodite, who was the goddess of love. Now, finally, before we move on from Greek statuary, I do want to address a question that will probably come up with regard to the male statues. And here I'm going to go back to Polykleitos' Doryphorus. And that is, if you view a lot of ancient Greek or ancient Roman statuary for that matter, one particular part of the male anatomy may begin to stand out to you, or rather won't stand out, and that is the fact that almost all examples of ancient Greek statuary, when they're depicting a male subject in the nude, they have very small, well, let's just say very small packages, very small genitalia. Why is that? Why are almost all ancient Greek statues depicted showing very small penises? Well, first, because they're usually depicted that way because they're not being depicted in a state of sexual arousal. So they're probably flaccid. So you'd expect them to be smaller. But the second part of the answer to that question is that the ancient Greeks, weirdly enough, considered large penises as a sign of a foolish or lustful human being. There's a legend in Greek mythology about a lesser god named Priapus, the god of pleasure and wine, who offended the goddess Hera, who of course is the queen of Mount Olympus, the wife of Zeus, and gets cursed by Hera with a permanent erection. So most large phalluses in Greek art tend to be associated with foolish and lustful men, or with animal-like satyrs, who were half man, half goat, or half horse. And so Greek artists unconsciously or perhaps even consciously associated large phalluses with an overactive libido. And since the Platonic ideal was that one's reason should govern one's passion or emotion, having too active of a sex drive could be seen as a liability. Okay, now let's talk about Greek architecture. Ancient Greece, like Egypt, produced numerous architectural marvels that continue to astound us today. Unlike Egypt, whose most celebrated architectural achievements were designed to memorialize or entomb their honored dead, most of Greece's great monuments were meant to serve the living. The largest structures in most city-states were theaters, amphitheaters, or temples, all of which would have been meant for everyday use and would have served as communal meeting places. These facts are indicative of the humanist theme that suffused the world of Greek art. The themes of simplicity and clarity and balance and symmetry were also crucial to Greek architecture, and the best example of this is the Parthenon. The Parthenon is the famous temple to Athena that sat atop the Acropolis. An Acropolis is a citadel usually located on top of a hill in a city-state that often contained temples, treasuries, armories, and other public buildings. In this case, the Parthenon was a temple to Athena that sat atop the Acropolis in the city of Athens. The Parthenon is a rectangle-shaped structure approximately 70 meters long by 31 meters wide, with 46 34-foot outer columns, 17 on either side long ways and 8 on either end, to go along with 2 rows of interior columns with matching inner porticos on either end. But perhaps the most interesting feature of the Parthenon is its use of a geometrical principle called the golden ratio. The golden ratio. What is the golden ratio, you may ask? Well, simply put, the golden ratio is the ratio of the sides of a special type of rectangle, also called a golden rectangle. A ratio of width to length, the ratio of the width to length on a golden rectangle is 1 to 1.618. Again, that ratio for the ratio of the width to length on a golden rectangle is 1 to 1.618. Now, the interesting thing about a golden rectangle is that if you cut off a perfect square from the rectangle, the remaining rectangle will also be a golden rectangle. So as you can see here from this diagram, the rectangle that encloses the front of the Parthenon is a golden rectangle. If you cut off a perfect square from it, the remaining rectangle will also be a golden rectangle. And if you cut off a perfect square from that rectangle, the remaining rectangle will also be a golden rectangle. And you can subdivide it kind of to infinity, till the point where you get down to a tiny, almost microscopic golden rectangle. So admittedly, that begs the question, was this by design? Did the architects who designed the Parthenon intentionally build the golden rectangle into its designs? The answer to that question is we're not 100% sure. This is a theory, particularly since we don't know exactly how high the Parthenon really was, given that its roof is missing. uh, but but it seems to work. It seems to work. So it's definitely a possibility that the architects who designed this building were aware of the golden rectangle and intentionally built it into their design. And also, if you circumscribe any of the columns, any two columns within the Parthenon, uh, the resulting rectangle will also be a golden rectangle. So that's it for Greek architecture, and that's it for the classical style in sculpture and architecture as a whole. In part two, we're going to pick up with the poetry of the classical period.